An alien revealed to me the dark side of the law of attraction, and what he showed me will shock you. That sentence lived in Dorothy Dot Castano's head like a headline she couldn't unsee. It wasn't sensational to her anymore. It was confession. For 10 years, she had done everything the teacher said. Vision boards that bloomed with glossy images of coastal homes and travel, morning mantras so polished she could recite them in her sleep, a ritual jar of receiving notes she'd emptied and refilled a dozen times. She led global marketing teams, closed multi-million-dollar pitches, spoke on stages about growth. Her calendar was full, her LinkedIn looked flawless, and her paychecks arrived like clockwork. Still, every month, the numbers in her bank account were the same quiet humiliation. Auto rejects from student loan relief, a creeping notice about a missed payment, the kind of small, sharp panic that turned a dinner into a problem set. Can I afford this? Should I accept this lunch? It wasn't scarcity the way some people understood it. She had money coming in. It was a recurrent, corrosive pattern that made her give it away, lose it, or ignore the small responsible things that keep money working for you. It felt like a handbrake clamped on her future every time she tried to accelerate. You could call that irony. Dot called it a private cruelty. She learned to hide it well. In boardrooms, she spoke with the crispness expected of someone who had climbed the ladder, and in elevators, she practiced the "I am abundant" line until its edges were dull. At home, between glossy magazines and the faint scent of bergamot from a candle she could barely afford to burn, she would stare at the vision board and feel a hollow where hope should be. The image of a house on the board seemed farther away with every competently executed affirmation. "You did everything right," she told herself in the mirror the morning the August statement showed a tiny, humiliating overdraft. Something else is wrong. That phrase, "something else," is the hook of most good stories, the soft, audible click that signals a deeper motor hidden under the car's hood. It is what took Dot from ritual to desperation, not disbelief in the method, but a slow, burning suspicion that the method was missing something essential, a part of herself she had never invited to the table. If you're watching this because you've ever felt that same sick twist of déjà vu after saying the right words and watching your life disagree, stay with me. If you want a practical guide that follows the story, belief bridge templates, scripts for inner dialogue, starter exercises, the pinned comment has a free workbook that walks you through each step shown here. On the surface, Dot's life looked like stability. On the inside, it had been built on tiny votes of shame, learned long before she understood money. Those votes came from people who loved her, from offhand rules that stitched themselves into the fabric of her identity. The voice of her mother, soft and imperious, kept a corner of Dot's mind warm with moral conviction. "Real people don't flaunt things, Dorothy. Rich folks are soft. Pride gets you nowhere." It wasn't cruelty, it was a catechism of caution, an economy of modesty that equated discretion with virtue. To Dot, kindness and generosity were sister virtues, but they arrived with a price tag. Generosity had to be radical and self-sacrificing to be pure. Then there was her father, a man who left when she was 7, packing the only suitcase he had room for with a handful of unpaid bills and a promise that the move was temporary. He never returned for the reasons he gave, and what Dot's mind did was far more creative than any moral explanation. It built a causal loop. Money meant betrayal. Money meant shifting loyalties. The presence of cash in the equation could persuade people to leave, change, or trade who they were for something else. He became a pattern as much as a person, a symbol embedded in the nervous system that equated financial gain with relational loss. Dot's church background added another layer. Sermons that praised the modest, anxious whispers about the vanity of wealth, store up treasures in heaven, echoed in her inner room like a wind chime, beautiful and disorienting. Those phrases were not the foundation of her life, but they furnished the architecture. Together, the whispers and the absences and the holy warnings formed a subterranean curriculum: how to be moral, how to be safe, and how to make money a forbidden joy. These early lessons didn't announce themselves as doctrine. They arrived in 1,000 small, decisive moments. The time her mother hid a new coat under the bed so neighbors wouldn't see it. The evening a cousin joked that being rich made you shady. The time her father walked out, folding his anger into a sentence about not being able to provide. Each event stayed behind like a small bruise, inconspicuous until pressure hit the exact spot and the memory flared. Dot's adult behaviors mapped eerily onto those memories. When she received a bonus, she would find ways to give it away quickly. A friend's medical bill covered with a single transaction. A surprise gift to a colleague who needed it more. When an investment opportunity required patient, boring maintenance like replacing a roof or updating bookkeeping, she would postpone, rationalize, and then feel furious at herself when the cost doubled. She dated partners who had integrity problems and then lavished cash on them, as if money could seal the leaks. Her generosity felt like penance, her risk-taking like a dare to prove she wasn't soft. In moments of panic, a separate voice rose, not hers, but an internalized chorus she recognized as the shadow. She called it that once, reading Jung late at night on a cross-country flight. The shadow's lines were short and efficient. "Money will take them away," the voice would say. "You cannot keep more than you deserve. If you want to be loved, give, and give until love returns, perhaps." These weren't rational beliefs so much as the operating system running quietly beneath her conscious intentions. No amount of repeated "I am abundant" would patch a corrupted OS. So she read more. She doubled down on courses that promised acceleration, manifesting practitioners with streamlined strategies, breathwork with community, podcasts with million-dollar success stories presented as step-by-step recipes. Each technique offered a new bolt, a newer, glittering tool supposed to dislodge the handbrake. She tried them all. Nothing budged beyond the occasional dammed-up relief that washed out as quickly as it came. The repetition began to feel cruel. The universe, if it were listening, seemed politely indifferent. One late winter night, after a particularly costly emotional loan to a friend who refused to repay, Dot sat on the floor of her apartment and pressed her forehead to the carpet. The breathing exercises did their rhythmic thing. In for 5, out for 7. They didn't do the thing they were supposed to do, make the dread smaller. The room smelled faintly of coffee someone had left in a travel mug by mistake. The city outside was a smear of traffic and neon. For the first time in years, doubt ate past the ritual into something she couldn't fix with a checklist. She thought about selling everything. She thought about quitting. She thought about the possibility that what she was doing, the vision boards, the affirmations, the endless performative releasing, was not just ineffective, but obfuscating. Each technique was like painting a door that led nowhere. It was then that the light came. It wasn't like in the movies. It was a precise, bluish pulse under the doorway that made the carpet fluoresce in a way that felt intimate rather than theatrical. The air near the light had a metallic quietness, like the inside of a shell where the ocean's roar is filtered. For a second, Dot imagined she'd left an LED lamp on in the hall. But the light moved, soft, deliberate, and a shape gathered in it, slender and vertical, less anthropomorphic than suggestive of an outline, a presence that seemed shaped by attention rather than by flesh. She didn't scream. She had the surreal calm of someone suspended in disbelief, the kind that waits to see whether the world will correct itself. Instead, she watched the shape and felt an odd relief, as if an answer she had always suspected might simply arrive late. A voice came, not over the air, but inside her head. It was clear, precise, and intentionally free of the human urgency she carried. The voice had a cadence like a clock, and a tenderness like a map unfolded. You are always manifesting. It was the sentence that split the night cleanly. Not an accusation, a fact. Not an instruction, an observation. You are always manifesting. Dot found herself replying without intending to. I know that, she thought, but not like this. The voice, the presence, spoke again, softer. Then, see. It didn't say, I will show you in a theatrical way. It said, see, as if it were turning a camera to a screen that had been paused. The air around Dot felt cool and intimate, like the inside of a vault where memories were catalogued. The presence didn't speak with a gender she could categorize. Its voice felt feminine to her in the way some languages feel feminine, an association more than a fact. Whether this was something external in the room or a deep, imaginative projection inside her own mind, Dot could not tell. That ambiguity allowed her to consent. She allowed it. What followed was not a montage of quick images, but a layered, immersive reliving. The first memory that unspooled was not the most dramatic. It was the small, domestic choreography of shame. Dot was 5. Her mother held a brand new dress in her hands and pressed it to the young girl's chest like a secret. She closed the bedroom door, turned the dress inside out, and tucked it under the bed. Don't let them see, her mother whispered. People talk. Better to keep modesty. We don't need eyes on us. That scene, the gentle act of hiding a thing, lodged in Dot as a schema. Visibility invites judgment. Photographs of abundance must be concealed, because being seen invites gossip, and gossip invites loss. The belief that a display of well-being would summon moral censure was quiet and efficient. It didn't accuse wealth of immorality, so much as teach that wealth should be performed in ways that erased joy. As the memory faded, the presence guided Dot into another, her father at the kitchen table, cheeks hollow, voice tight. I can't do this here, he said. He folded his hands around an unsteady coffee mug. There's too much pressure. I'm leaving for a while. 7-year-old Dot pressed her hands flat to the table as if she could keep him there by force alone. He stood, slung a cheap duffel over his shoulder, and in the doorway he glanced back not with apology, but with the furtive calculation of someone choosing between safety and staying. For the child in that kitchen, the meaning was simple. Money precedes love. Where money is scarce, so is loyalty. His absence taught proximity the currency of suspicion. The third memory arrived like a stain in a song. Church announcements about humility. A pastor's well-meant admonition that worldly riches can distract the soul. The congregation nodded. Dot learned to feel thin with any exuberance about material comfort, like she had accepted a soil that was poor and would not sustain luxuriant growth. The lesson was not direct condemnation, but an allocation of moral weight. Save your spiritual applause for heaven, keep your earthly successes private. These were the parts the voice showed her, not to punish but to label, the learned associations that would act like an autopilot. They were not fantastic events. They were how a life was quietly wired. Dot watched herself in each memory, felt herself 5 and 7 and 9 and older, and noticed something else, the exact visceral sensation that accompanied each verdict about money. It was a tightening, a clench of the abdomen that people sometimes call gut fear, but which in Dot felt more like a mechanical lock engaging. When the lock clicked, her body read it as instruction. Hold less, give away what's safe. Don't fix what's boring and responsible, because fixing looks like investment, and investment looks like entanglement. The presence, the one that called itself neither judge nor savior, let the scene sit. Then, without melodrama, it made a small observation. You keep the handbrake on. It didn't say it as metaphor, it said it as diagnosis. Dot felt the truth of the line in a physical way. She had known, somewhere, that she was sabotaging her own acceleration. But to hear the exact image of a handbrake, a mechanism designed to prevent movement, named aloud in a voice that didn't carry her shame, was almost a relief. If there was a lever, maybe it could be released. But the presence didn't offer a tool yet. Instead, it invited a conversation. It asked Dot to watch what she did with money now. It asked her, gently, to remember not only the memories, but the choices that sprang from them. The impulse loans, the deferred maintenance, the gifts that felt like penance. It didn't say these things to condemn. It showed patterns as a clinician might show a patient an X-ray. Dot remembered the last time she refused to fix her car because what if next month the mortgage takes priority, and how that refusal cost her twice as much in the end. She remembered the evenings she stayed up playing spreadsheets to feel like she could control the chaos, and mornings when, after a night of manifesting, she would wake thinking of the friend who needed the emergency cash. She felt the logic of her own life as if reading someone else's case study. At one point, when she tried to argue with the presence, a voice in her head rose, sharper and possessive. "You can't keep what you don't deserve," it said, in her mother's timbre. Dot answered, not aloud, but with an inner formal script she had never before used. She borrowed a therapeutic phrase she had read. "Thank you, Shadow, for protecting me. I hear you. I will not abandon you, but I will ask you to try a new job." It felt strangely ceremonial, like giving an old, loyal dog a new collar. For a breath, the presence seemed to approve. "Good," it said. "Recognition before replacement." That line, recognition before replacement, landed like a small law. You cannot displace an old program without acknowledging its labor. The past beliefs had tried to keep Dot safe by making her poor in small ways. They had protected something in her before she could manage adult responsibility. The presence was not cruel, it simply named function. As the light receded and Dot's living room reconstituted itself, she sat on her floor and breathed. The apartment seemed unchanged, except for a tiny new texture of clarity. She could see the seams between the teachings she'd received and the choices she made. It was not closure, and the presence did not promise closure. It had brought her to the edge of a map. She felt an urgent energy then, a kind that comes right before action. Not panic, but the briskness of someone who has been given a dangerous key. The presence's voice, gentle, alien, precise, said one more thing before it dimmed. "You are always manifesting. The shadow manifests more strongly than intention." Dot felt that phrase like a note struck in a room that had been listening for years. It explained all those evenings of rituals that led nowhere. Her unconscious was a freight train. Affirmations were paper planes. The revelation felt like accusation and explanation braided together, and the intensity of that twin feeling made her catch at the carpet as if she might fall into a gorge of old self-blame. Except she didn't fall. She stayed sitting on the floor, hands folded around her knees, and the knowledge settled in like weather, unavoidable for now, but transitory. The presence's parting pulse softened into the usual city hum, and the night closed around her like a door. The next morning she was late for work. Her inbox was merciless, and the world demanded competence. She dressed like a woman who had a narrative to uphold and drove into gray traffic. The episode of the night before folded in her chest like an unread letter. She tested the edges of it all day with small, almost shy behaviors. When a colleague asked to borrow money for a side project, she hesitated and then refused with a new sentence. "I can't help right now, but I can help connect you to resources." A month ago, she would have covered a substantial portion and then resented the expenditure. The new sentence felt awkward at first, like a language she was learning at 42. There was a tremor in her chest, the old handbrake's echo, but also a thin thread of exhilaration. The alien statements, if they had been real, had given her better names for what was happening. If not, then they were a metaphor that had managed, by accident, to name something true. There is a practical boundary I want to set here before we go deeper. If any of what you're seeing resonates because you have experienced severe trauma, crippling patterns, or active mental health struggles, please consider seeking licensed professional support in addition to any spiritual or inner work. This story is not a substitute for clinical care. Dot did not have answers. She had new vocabulary and a fragile permission to look under the hood. Over the following weeks, she tried experiments that felt small at first and strange in their courage. She started a ledger she kept in her phone, not to micromanage, but to notice. What patterns showed up? When did she give without asking? When did she close things off because she feared being seen? Each observation was a data point her ego had long refused to collect. In one early test, she received a tax rebate, and instead of immediately spending it on something public and pleasing, she decided to allocate it to 3 buckets: a small repair fund, a modest pleasure jar, and a conversation with a financial advisor about responsible investing. She thought of the handbrake and imagined each bucket as a place to slowly unhook tiny clamps. At the advisor's office, she sat with a woman who asked questions that were practical and humane. How much do you want to save? What scares you about keeping more? Who benefits when you spend? The advisor validated the feelings as consequences of history, not as evidence of moral failure. Patterns are learned, she said. They can be unlearned. It wasn't a mystical promise, it was a clinical observation. And by naming the pattern in neutral terms, it gave Dot a non-shaming pathway forward. Still, old reactions came like seasonal storms. On a Tuesday, a midnight email announced a flash sale for designer boots, a brand her younger self had once coveted. The adrenaline zipped. The shadow's old script nudged her. Treat yourself now, because tomorrow you may have to sacrifice, and if you don't, you'll regret it. Dot felt the tug, then paused. She used a little script she was experimenting with, the same one she had said to the presence in the living room, but tweaked for the moment. Thank you, Shadow, for the impulse. I hear you. I choose to leave this for 2 days and revisit. 2 days later, the impulse had softened. The shoes were still there online, and she realized that desire had been partly about comfort and partly about a child's need to be seen. The delay didn't erase the need, but it allowed her to make a slightly more informed choice. The money in her account was the same in the immediate term, but the story inside her about what money meant had a crack in it, a fracture light enough to slide some new possibility through. If you're noticing the pattern in yourself as you listen, here's a tiny starter practice you can borrow right now. When a money impulse arrives, whether to buy, to give, or to hide, pause for a breath. Name the impulse out loud in one sentence. This is an impulse to X. Then say, thank you, I see you, and wait 2 days before acting. That's not a cure. It's a way to build an observational muscle. It's one small step Dot used. Weeks compounded. Sometimes she relapsed in a way that felt catastrophic. A friend in crisis, a compassionate loan that went unpaid, and she would return to the floor of her apartment and feel stupid for thinking a strange light could name years of wiring. Then she would remember the kitchen table and the dress under the bed, and the relapse began to feel less like failure and more like a phase in a longer, messy process. The presence returned once more, in a whisper of memory, a flash of blue, the soft telepathic clarity. It didn't need to speak much. The few sentences it offered cut to the marrow of how Dot's life had been playing out. The shadow will act faster than your intentions, it said. You made a soul-level choice before this lifetime to learn through pattern. That is not punishment. It is a curriculum. You have both hands on a lever. Let go of guilt first. Responsibility follows. Those last words, let go of guilt first, responsibility follows, destabilized Dot in a new way. She had wasted years wallowing in shame as if shame were a motivational tool. The presence suggested a different ethic. First, tender acknowledgement of the part that protected her. Second, firm steps toward new function. The idea that responsibility could be tender shocked her, because she had always associated responsibility with severity. The moment of transition, when guilt unknots and responsibility can be taken, is messy and luminous. It's also where most people get lost, because it demands more than embellished rituals. It asks for repeated, mundane choices. It asks for patience. It asks for steadiness. Dot's life did not change overnight. Her bank account did not suddenly swell into the glossy fantasies she had pinned to the board. What changed was the orientation of her actions. She began to watch, name, and slightly delay the patterns that it served as protective armor. There were weeks when the setbacks felt like proof that nothing could change. There were glimmers when an old cycle didn't reassert itself, and she felt genuinely surprised. Toward the end of the month, her landlord sent a polite notice about roof maintenance that required a contribution from tenants. Her instinct was to resent the cost, imagine predators around the corner, and hide her finances. But she had a new vocabulary now. She sat with the landlord's message, felt the old handbrake clench in her gut, and used a different sentence. "I will pay my share because a house maintained is a future preserved," she said to herself, more declaratively than before. The small act of repair, the tiny adult thing no vision board had ever told her to do, cost her a weekend of coffee money, not a fortune, and yet afterward, when a pipe leaked 3 months later and didn't escalate into catastrophe, she felt the quiet satisfaction of someone who had done an unromantic thing that mattered. And so the arc of Dot's story moved from ritualized magic to laborious noticing, from public spectacle to domestic stewardship. The presence had offered a diagnosis and a vocabulary. The rest of the work, the weeks and months of choices, the therapist visits, the awkward conversations with friends and family about money boundaries, would be the slow, unsexy part. The light had shown her the handbrake. Now there was a choice to be made about how to release it, whether to enlist help, and whether to stop blaming herself for patterns not of her choosing. On a rain-slick Thursday, as Dot walked home from a late meeting, her phone buzzed with a message from a woman she used to be, a LinkedIn connection who had seen one of Dot's talks years prior. "I loved your recent piece," the message read. "Have you ever thought about sharing your story? People need to hear this." Dot stared at the words and felt both the old impulse to hide and a new, light-tinged willingness to be seen. She remembered the dress under the bed and the kitchen table and the blue light. She felt the knowledge of a lever and an entire, quiet curriculum waiting to be practiced. The handbrake hissed faintly in the back of her chest. She put the phone away and walked into the rain, feeling for the first time in a long time like the wetness was not a judgment but a reminder of something larger than herself. The story had shifted direction, but the road was still long. The presence's lesson, the part about recognizing the shadow before trying to replace it, was a kind of invitation into a method that would demand more than wishful thinking. Dot inhaled and kept walking. The next scene, the next memory to unspool, the next practical step she would take, all of it waited ahead, a map partially sketched and partially hidden in the shade. She did not yet know how far the changes would go. She did not yet know whether her relationships would rearrange, whether old paradigms would insist on returning, or whether the small wins would compound into anything sizable. What she had learned was a grammar. How she used it would be revealed in imperfect practice. The presence had given her a vocabulary and a warning. The shadow is faster than intention, and the method everyone loves may be working against you if you never see the undercurrents. As the rainlight slid off the pavement and the city blurred around her, Dot understood there was a responsibility to be taken, not a punitive one, but a steady-handed stewardship over how she would allow her life to be remade. The momentum toward change was not dramatic, it was deliberate. Behind that deliberate step was a question the presence had left hanging like an unfinished chord. If the shadow had been protecting something, what role could it have now, once you understood it? The answer would require more than insight. It would require negotiation. The conversation was only beginning. The question the presence left suspended, what role could the shadow play now that it had been seen, moved from idea to instruction as the weeks unspooled. Dot discovered the presence of sentences did not belong to a set of exotic doctrines. They were tools that could be put into practice, blunt and peculiar as they were. The teaching that followed arrived not as a sermon, but as an anatomy lesson, precise, merciless in its clarity, and oddly consoling. You are always manifesting. That had been the first line. The night after the blue light, it became less like prophecy and more like a baseline fact she could use. The presence did not repeat itself in full, but its cadence returned in fitful memory during the work of each day. Over the next month, Dot mentally organized the pieces of what she'd been shown into 5 truths the presence had insisted on without fanfare. They were not mystical commandments, they were frames she could test. You are always manifesting, she repeated aloud one evening, as if trying on the voice of the present she wanted to live into. Saying it felt like orienting a compass. It helped her notice how a muttered frustration became a week-long gripe that guided her spending, how a private fear ballooned into a public pattern of over-apologizing that cost time and money. Manifestation was not a weekend exercise. It was a constant economy of emotional currency. The second truth settled like something practical and worrying. The shadow manifests more strongly than intention. Dot felt that in the smallness of her impulses. A shouted affirmation might buoy her for an afternoon, but a single moment of shame could redirect an entire savings plan. The shadow had velocity the conscious mind often lacked. It moved in reflexes and habit loops, not in speaker's circuits. Recognizing this wasn't guilt-inducing, it was clarifying. If the shadow acted faster, then the work had to begin there. The third truth cut deeper and wider than she expected. Manifestation occurs at soul level as well as ego level. This was the line that invited speculation. It was easy, from the skeptical seat of advertising deadlines and analytics dashboards, to dismiss talk of souls. Yet in Dot's case, something about that formulation held explanatory power. It reframed certain repeated choices as not merely poor planning, but chosen curricula, a phrasing that neither romanticized pain nor excused poor outcomes. The idea that some patterns were set at an identity-deep place made the work slower, yes, but also more compassionate. You weren't fighting a bad spreadsheet, you were renegotiating a contract you had signed before you had the language to read it. The fourth truth arrived with a neutral edge. The law is morally neutral. It responds to frequency, not morality. This was the sentence that felt dangerous to repeat. It could be misused by people wanting to justify selfishness. But for Dot, it was illuminating. Her childhood lessons had paired money with moral judgment. Seeing that the law, whatever metaphoric sense of law the presence implied, did not care about virtue, meant she could stop tying financial outcomes to a scoreboard of worth. Frequency, what you thought, felt, and did repeatedly, mattered. That meant technique without depth could amplify old patterns. An affirmation repeated in the same emotional tone would return old results. A new frequency required new feelings and new micro-decisions. The fifth truth was the most prosaic and the most protective. There is intentional lag and protection. The presence explained, in its spare way, that reality doesn't permit chaotic, instantaneously correctable miracles for the sake of psychic safety. Sudden shifts without corresponding internal preparations could be dangerous, to relationships, to the self's capacity to manage new realities. Dot thought about wealthy friends who had received sudden windfalls only to see them fracture marriages, create addictions, or combust businesses that had no operational scaffolding. The lag was not punishment, it was a protective deceleration. It demanded stewardship. Dot didn't hear these 5 truths as commandments from an alien court. She heard them as reframing she could test. Each one suggested a specific lever to pull. If the shadow was faster than intention, she needed to give the shadow a seat at the table instead of shouting instructions at it across a crowded room. The practical work began in small, almost ridiculous exercises. The presence's lessons suggested processes as if it understood human stubbornness. First recognition, then conversation, then rebuilding. The first step Dot adopted she called acknowledge and appoint. When an old instinct rose, the impulse to gift away a bonus, the sudden belief that fixing the roof was indulgent, she began by addressing the shadow out loud. Not in mystical incantation, but in a clinical-sounding exchange she had practiced with a stray therapy workbook open on her lap. "Thank you, Shadow, for keeping me safe," she would say in a tone that tried to be both tender and firm. "I know what you were trying to do. I will not abandon you. I am asking you to try a new job." The ritual felt theatrical the first few times, but it did something. It drew the operating system to the surface and put a human hand on it. Naming its service, that the shadow had protected when she could not, diminished the urge to punish the part for its methods. It reframed sabotage as strategy gone stale. She learned a scripted, fully spelled out inner dialogue the therapist later taught her. Dot began to use it daily until its cadence became less foreign. "Shadow, I see you. You kept me safe when I couldn't. I am grateful. I am not firing you. I'm asking you to help me choose one small new behavior this week. If you can do that, we'll do the next." When panic rose, she whispered, "Breathe." This is not mismanagement. It's protection trying to reroute. Let's ask it what it needs. The shtick of speaking to parts made the emotional volume drop by a half step. The shadow, formerly a voice that stormed, became an interlocutor. Her therapist, Mara, a careful Jungian who believed in naming with generous attention, called that the negotiation stance. Mara taught Dot that parts of the psyche that had been maladaptive were still doing something, preserving attachment, avoiding shame, or preventing loss. "We don't excise," Mara said in her cozy office overlooking the city park. "We repurpose." In Mara's office, Dot described the blue light with a mixture of embarrassment and gratitude. Mara listened without surprise. She did not need the alien to be literal to find value in Dot's experience. She treated it as an internalized guide that had externalized a diagnosis. "Whatever brought that experience," Mara said, "your psyche gave you a frame you could work with. Think of it as an experiential metaphor. The content matters less than the function. The presence labeled patterns. Now you have language." Mara walked Dot through a practical sequence that combined inner work with grounded financial steps. She suggested 3 layers: an emotional practice, a behavioral scaffold, and a reality test. The emotional practice was the inner dialogue. The behavioral scaffold was a simple ledger and auto-transfer plan. The reality test was a small, trackable expense that would prove new choices could be made without catastrophic fallout. "You won't dissolve history," Mara cautioned. "You'll rewire pathways. Expect relapses and recalibrate after them." This was the professional validation Dot needed. The alien's teachings had been theatrical. Mara's framing made them utilitarian. The first real test came in the form of a request she had dreaded. Her sister, Louisa, called to ask for help with an overdue rent. Their family dynamics were complicated. Helping Louisa had often meant sacrificing Dot's own financial breathing room. The old script would have her wire 6 months' rent and then resent it secretly. Instead, Dot leaned on the scaffold. She said, "I care about you. I can contribute X towards setting up a repayment plan and connect you with a counselor and a budgeting coach. I won't cover all of it." Her sister's voice broke in the phone. "Is that all?" "It is what I can do sustainably," Dot said. "I won't set either of us up to fail." The line between generosity and self-erasure had never been more visible. Louisa's initial anger at the boundary stung, then softened into an awkward gratitude. The repayment plan came imperfectly over months. Dot's heart clenched sometimes when a payment was late. She had to practice not translating late payments into moral failure about herself. Dot also built belief bridges, deliberate, intermediate statements that sat between the old catastrophic belief and the untested new identity. A belief bridge had to be specific, believable, and actionable. For financial work, Dot used 3 tiers. If the old belief was, if I keep money, people will leave, a bridge could be, I can keep a small reserve while still showing up for others. Being solvent helps me be more present. That sentence was specific enough to be actionable. Keep a $1,000 emergency fund, then check in weekly with family. It didn't flip the script from zero to hero, it created a plausible middle ground. If the old belief was, rich people are dishonest, a bridge might be, I can practice financial transparency in small circles and test whether honesty aligns with abundance. The experiment could be, create a shared tracking sheet with a partner for 1 month. For relationship fears, Dot wrote, I can build boundaries that allow generosity without losing myself. Then she practiced, decline a last-minute request that would cost her an evening without harm. She translated the same method into other domains to prove the template's flexibility. For health anxieties, a bridge could be, I don't have to be perfect to improve. I can add 1 20-minute walk 3 times a week and see if energy shifts. For career boundary work, a bridge could be, I can decline 1 speaking engagement that pays poorly and use the time to prepare a higher value pitch. These bridges were not magical promises. They were experiments that created evidence. That evidence, repeated, would shift frequency. Dot kept a small physical notebook she called the Ledger of Tests. Each entry tracked an impulse, the script she used, the bridge she built, the action she took, and the outcome. It became a slow archive of data, proof that her nervous system could learn a new dance. Seeing weeks of choices recorded in ink did the same work that vision boards once had, but with more integrity. This was messy, granular, and human. Her financial advisor, Lena, became the pragmatic partner in translating inner work into structural changes. Lena did not care for metaphors. She cared for cash flow and buffers. Yet, she didn't dismiss Dot's psychological experiments. They met in a small conference room with green plants and an espresso machine that claimed to be artisanal. Lena recommended a 3-tier automated system, an emergency fund, a scheduled giving budget, a conscious generosity lane, and a maintenance account for household repairs. The idea, Lena said, is to remove decision fatigue. When the accounts are earmarked, your nervous system has fewer alarms to pull on. They programmed a modest percentage of Dot's paycheck to flow automatically, 5% to emergency, 3% to maintenance, 2% to a pleasure fund. It was not thrilling, but it felt like scaffolding. Lena also helped Dot model cash flow for an investment project she had stalled on. Part of the delay had been perfectionism and fear. Lena broke the work into steps with timelines and small measurable milestones. The plan made the future less uncanny. Dot's therapist and financial advisor did 2 things together that changed the character of her practice. They validated that psychological material mattered in money and offered structural ways to move forward. Words like auto-transfer held the same spiritual weight as acknowledge the shadow when they prevented a panic purchase at midnight. Relapses still happened with the stubborn predictability of seasons. A cousin's medical emergency triggered an old reflex. Dot wired money without a conversation and then felt ashamed for days. But the relapses were different now, shorter, less annihilating. She recovered faster because she had a ledger, a therapist to process with, and a plan to correct the next step. Her practice expanded beyond private experiments into public courage. A local nonprofit invited speakers to host a workshop on money and meaning. Dot had always declined those invitations, preferring to speak about brand growth, not personal vulnerability. But one damp Saturday she accepted. She did not tell the organizers about the blue light. She told the human story, the handbrake, the dress under the bed, the kitchen table. And the crowd leaned forward in a way that made her chest feel both tender and furious with gratitude. Someone in the back raised their hand and said, "How do you start? My impulse is to cheer myself up by shopping." Dot shared the inner dialogue script and a belief bridge she custom-made for the room. She felt alive in an anxious, nervous way. Afterwards, several attendees lingered, offering versions of the same confession. I thought I was the only one. That phrase echoed in her head like a counterweight to the years of hiding. Those workshops became a second laboratory. Dot observed that people responded better to tangible microhabits than platitudes. When she taught the 2-day delay for impulses, name it, thank it, wait 2 days, she saw relief ripple across faces. Sometimes a practiced exercise led a person to cry in the chair. Sometimes it led to laughter of relief. The work was not glamorous, but it was durable. One of the most instructive moments came from a relapsing week that looked from the outside like failure. An old lover texted asking for an emergency cash loan. The voice that lured Dot into giving early in their relationship rose like an old radio signal. "You helped before," it whispered. "If you do it again, you'll prove your loyalty." This was a classic shadow script, protective in origin but costly in present form. Dot felt the familiar compulsion, then paused. She used the inner dialogue. "Shadow, I see you. If we pay, we might create dependence. Let's offer coaching resources and a one-time small grant instead." The lover was furious. The relationship frayed further. Dot grieved, then sat with the grief without translating it into the currency of self-punishment. The weeks that followed were marked by smaller, steadier wins. She repaired her aging boiler rather than waiting for a catastrophic burst. The cost was predictable. The absence of crisis was the quiet payoff. She built a modest $5,000 emergency buffer over 6 months. Not miraculous, but real. Her credit score inched up. Her sense of self-efficacy did not explode into hubris. It thickened into something steadier. At the 6-month mark, Dot sat with Mara and tried putting language around what had shifted. "I don't want to overclaim," she said. "This isn't the movie ending where the boardroom applause crescendos and the house arrives at the curb. But I can say something did change." Mara nodded. "Change is often granular. You're learning new ways to show up. The shadow hasn't disappeared. It's been invited to hold a different job." Dot thought back to the presences line. You made a soul-level choice before this lifetime to learn through pattern. She could accept the language as metaphor or as literal, but either way it helped her stop lobbing blame at herself. That shift from shame to stewardship was the quiet pivot of her work. As Dot's practice matured, she developed a series of templates she used in workshops and recorded in the pinned workbook that now sat in the comments under a talk she had posted online. One of the core tools was the 3-step inner dialogue for money impulses, which she presented like a ritual stripped of mystique. 1. Name the impulse. I notice an urge to X. Buy, give, hide. 2. Thank the part. Shadow. I see you and I appreciate what you tried to do to keep me safe. 3. Delay and decide. I will wait Y hours days and then choose. If the decision still feels right, I will act intentionally. She offered scripts for common situations, such as supporting family members, resisting panic purchases during sales, and negotiating boundaries with friends who asked for repeated loans. Each script was deliberately banal in phrasing so audiences could adopt them quickly. Belief bridges multiplied across domains. For career anxieties, she suggested, I can test one leadership boundary this quarter and observe the real outcomes. For health, I can add one sustainable habit and track energy, not perfection. The bridges were scaffolds that created tolerable experiments. A turning point arrived when Dot was asked to consult with a friend running a small startup. Their business was hemorrhaging due to neglected maintenance, half-broken checkout systems, untracked subscriptions draining capital, deferred legal fees. The startup's founder had the classic entrepreneurial shadow, risk as prove worth. Dot's advice was unglamorous. Allocate a maintenance budget, hire a fractional operations manager, automate savings for legal contingencies. The founder implemented the changes and, over months, lost less revenue to preventable catastrophes. To Dot, the victory was not in the startup's scale, but in the translation of shadow work into operational health. Meanwhile, the idea that the law responds to frequency began to take on a quantitative feel. Dot noticed that when she practiced the new behaviors, regular maintenance, delayed impulses, scripted boundaries, the frequency of scrapes decreased. Frequency was not a mystical energy. It was a pattern of decisions that created new inputs into her day-to-day life. The environment responded because her actions had changed. She also learned humility about time. The presence's warning about lag had practical implications. If the nervous system had been trained for scarcity, it could only tolerate gradual increases in resource availability. Ramp up too quickly, and relationships, identity, and the self's capacity might not keep pace. That meant Dot deliberately paced some opportunities. Rather than taking a big raise and immediately expanding her lifestyle, she incrementally reallocated funds to axes aligned with the life she wanted. Publicly, Dot's narrative matured into a talk she called the Shadows Contract. She spoke about the 5 truths without dramatic cosmic claims. She presented them as frameworks that helped people map patterns they lived. She used the handbrake metaphor, the idea that unseen brakes can hold back competent drivers, and the practical steps she had tested. Audiences responded. She began seeing people in the crowd who had been stuck in the same energetic loops she once had. As her visibility grew, so did ambivalence. Some people demanded a literal retelling of the alien encounter. Dot navigated the line between disclosure and interpretation. In interviews, she learned to say, "I had an experience that gave me a frame." You can read it as literal, symbolic, or somewhere between. What matters is the practice. The ambiguity kept the public conversation generative rather than dogmatic. The longer arc of change included painful moments of relational recalibration. Her mother, still cautious about visibility, bristled when Dot started publicly talking about money boundaries. "Don't show family business," her mother warned, old catechisms crackling in her voice. Dot chose her boundaries carefully. She did not weaponize tools against family love. She called her mother often and included her in small, private celebrations of wins. She also practiced saying no when asked for second mortgages on emotional terms. Her father's absence remained a knot she could not entirely untie. There were days when anger leaked into spectacle, and she found herself wanting to punish the past by hoarding or by reckless spending. Here, the ledger and the therapist were crucial. She processed grief slowly and translated some of the pain into the decision to build predictable systems that couldn't be destabilized by abandonment. 16 months after the light, Dot hosted a small workshop in a community center where she taught the inner dialogue and belief bridge exercises. She decided, at the last minute, to tell a select truth. She didn't claim the encounter as objective fact. She told the room that whether the presence had been an external visitation or a deep psychic intervention was less important than the function the story served. People nodded as if relieved. The ambiguity made the work accessible. At the end of the workshop, a woman named Tara, mid-30s, exhausted, clutching a thermos, came up to Dot and said, "I was the person who thought I was greedy for wanting to save. You gave me permission to be pragmatic and kind. That felt like a miracle." Dot felt a rush of misplaced modesty, and then something steadier. The sense that practical work could look like miracles because it restored people's capacity to steward their lives. The last hard test in Dot's story unfolded in a way she had anticipated and feared. An unexpected job restructuring offered a furlough that could have blown her plans. The hospitality of the advice she had been given would be tested. She had built a $5,000 buffer, but the furlough threatened more prolonged instability. Dot did not panic. She used the same frameworks she had developed. She negotiated with her landlord for deferred rent with a plan to catch up, invoked her emergency fund and reduced discretionary spending, and took a part-time consulting gig. She continued to practice her inner dialogue script when the handbrake clicked. The furlough lasted 3 months. During that time, she used the period to teach 2 online workshops and write a structured workbook on belief bridges. Her income was less than before, but she weathered the storm without the cataclysmic identity collapse she might once have feared. Those months were instructive because they proved a hypothesis. The work didn't keep waves from coming, but it increased Dot's buoyancy. She had more skills to respond, more scripts to fall back on, and a community of peers who understood the language she used. Instead of a lone, shame-laden survival, her life became a series of negotiated responses. In the quiet aftermath of recovery, Dot sat at her kitchen table and watched the city through rain-streaked glass. The handbrake metaphor had become less dramatic and more domestic. She would still feel a slight resistance when she tried to accelerate, but she now knew how to release it, in part, and to enlist help when it held too firm. The presence's last lessons still echoed. Let go of guilt first, responsibility follows. And Dot worked to embody that ethic. Letting go of guilt did not mean complacency. It meant tenderness in action. Responsibility followed not as burden, but as practical stewardship. If you are listening now and wondering whether your own rituals might be missing an underlayer, here are 3 concise starter practices you can borrow from Dot's work. Simple, repeatable, and designed to build evidence rather than demand instant transformation. First, the naming pause. When an impulse arrives related to money, relationships, or health, name it out loud. This is an impulse to X. Offer a 1-sentence thank you to the part doing the job it knows how to do. Delay decision-making for a fixed period. 2 days for purchases, 24 hours for emotional messages, 1 week for complicated offers. Use the delay to consult a ledger, a friend, or a professional. Second, belief bridges. Identify a core catastrophic belief and write a short, believable bridge between the old story and a new possibility. Make the bridge measurable. If your old belief is, if I save, I'll be judged, try, I will save $100 a month and see whether being solvent causes social backlash or increased confidence. Track what actually happens. Third, micro repairs. Commit to one unromantic maintenance act that prevents larger costs. Update software subscriptions, fix a leaky faucet, schedule a dental cleaning. The action is prosaic. The payoff is resilience. These practices are not replacements for therapy. If you are dealing with severe trauma or crippling patterns, please seek licensed support alongside any inner work you do. When Dot published the workbook that grew from her ledger and her workshops, she resisted making sweeping promises. The title was plain, A Workbook for Noticing, Naming, and Negotiating Your Shadow. It offered scripts, belief bridge templates, the inner dialogue examples she had used, and a 6-week practice calendar. The pinned comment under the talk included a link for those who wanted the scaffold. Her final scenes were less cinematic than the blue light, but more consequential. On a quiet evening, she checked her accounts and saw the modest gains of a year of disciplined, awkward practice. A slow buildup of reserves, a maintenance account that had paid for a repaired roof without panic, a small pleasure fund that allowed a real vacation without the usual hand-wringing. She had not arrived at the glossy house pinned to her vision board, but she felt a different kind of wealth, the ability to steward resources with less shame and more curiosity. One afternoon, at a volunteer-run financial literacy event, a man in the audience stood up and simply said, "I stopped lying to myself about why I spend." The room clapped as if their own courage had found voice in him. Dot felt a quiet close to the arc that had begun with the blue light. The presence had shown her the handbrake. People in that room were learning how to take their hands off of it, together. There is a final humility to this story that Dot accepted. The presence had revealed the dark side of the law of attraction, not to demonize the method, but to expose its blind spot. Techniques and rituals can be powerful amplifiers, for better or worse, and without attending to inner protective patterns, they will simply accelerate the status quo. Recognize the shadow, thank it, and then ask it to work differently. Build small, believable bridges. Use practical scaffolds so that when the external circumstances shift, you have the capacity to manage them. If this resonates and you want concrete templates to begin your own work, scripts for inner dialogues, belief bridge examples tailored for finances, relationships, and health, plus a 6-week practice calendar, the workbook linked in the pinned comment walks you through each step I described. It is not a promise of overnight miracles. It is a set of experiments for people willing to do slow, earnest labor. Dot's story does not end with a final cinematic reveal. She continued to have messy weeks and moments of relapse. She also continued to gain small, durable wins. The alien, whether literal or symbolic, had given her a lens and a vocabulary. The real labor was the daily implementation, the negotiation with parts, the willingness to choose differently in tiny, accumulating ways. On a late summer evening, Dot stood in front of a modest room of people sharing their stories. She spoke about the dress under the bed and the man at the table and the sermons that made privacy seem holy. She taught the scripts, the bridges, the ledger. When someone asked whether she truly believed the presence had been an outsider, she smiled and said, "It doesn't change the work. You can call it whatever helps you see your patterns. The point is to notice, to name, and to practice new choices." The lights in the room were warm. Someone else spoke after her and shared a breakthrough about a saving habit. The small cheers felt like a village. Dot went home that night and made a modest donation from her pleasure fund to a community literacy program. She sent a text to her sister offering to help with a budgeting app. She put a post-it on the kitchen shelf that read, in her handwriting, "Recognition before replacement." Out on the street, the city hummed. The blue light that had once pulsed in her doorway remained, for her, both a literal memory and a metaphor. Whether or not an alien had whispered the 5 truths, the work these truths required was human and ongoing. Dot had been shown that the law of attraction's dark side was less a conspiracy and more an unexamined part of the soul that, when left uninvited, would manifest faster than any deliberate plan. If you're ready to begin this practical, patient work, the workbook in the pinned comment contains the scripts, templates, and a 6-week plan to help you start noticing and negotiating your own shadow. It is an invitation to responsibility that starts with tenderness. Dot turned off the lamp, walked to the window, and watched the city lights steady into the night. The handbrake was not gone. Sometimes it hissed at odd moments. But she had learned to look for its seam, to thank the mechanism that had once kept her from worse harm, and to ask it to help her steward the life she was actually committed to building. She breathed, feeling for the first time like stewardship could be a kind of forgiveness. Dot turned off the lamp, walked to the window, and watched the city lights steady into the night. The handbrake was not gone. Sometimes it hissed at odd moments. But she had learned to look for its seam, to thank the mechanism that had once kept her from worse harm, and to ask it to help her steward the life she was actually committed to building. She breathed, feeling for the first time like stewardship could be a kind of forgiveness.